Hello everyone, welcome to Art of the Week with Katya. You're joining me this time outside of the Scuola di Dalmazia in Venice, near the Greek quarter, sort of Greek Orthodox quarter. This building was originally built in 1358. It was originally the hospice of St. Catherine. In 1451, it became one of the confraternities, one of the many confraternities of Venice. There were over 200 at the time. And this particular one, was for the immigrating group of people called the Schiavoni, which was a mixed group of people from Dalmatia, from Ilaria, from Sorbros, and from Croatia. So all of these people lived more or less in this neighborhood, and this was their confraternity. This building would continue to be built and renovated until this facade was finished in 1551 by one of the proto-architects of the Arsenale, which should be noted is just in that direction. It's quite close. Now, so this group, the Schiavoni, a lot of them came from the shores of Dalmatia, which lay on the eastern parts of the Adriatic. So they came from there to Venice, partially for historians have debated exactly why. One historian has pointed out that it was a largely economic migration that happened. And was partially considered this way because of the Venetian power. Dalmatia, the eastern shores of the Adriatic, at a certain point were part of the Venetian Empire, so their moving here wouldn't exactly be abnormal from that perspective. But there is another aspect to consider here. As I explained, the school was founded, the confraternity was founded in 1451. It should be acknowledged that Constantinople changes hands only 2 years later in 1453 and becomes the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Now, under the Ottoman Empire, we see a much larger migration of people from Dalmatia, from these areas, the Schiavoni peoples, into Venice. Now, what's interesting about this group in particular is that their actual profession, they were called stradieri, which a lot of them, which was a type of foot soldier, basically a soldier. And I did mention also that this confraternity is very near the Arsenale, which where they built the ships in Venice, and many of them also were documented shipbuilders as well as mariners in the Venetian Navy, which was incredibly powerful at this time. Now, we can understand from this perspective a little bit more why we have so many images of St. George around this confraternity. Before we get into that, though, I should mention a confraternity is in itself it's a meeting place, a gathering place of a community of peoples in Venice. There were many of them, over 200, as I mentioned. And it was basically a meeting place for the people of that group to discuss politics, to arrange for various things. It was their link to Venetian society at large, even though they were a migrated group who worked not at particularly high ranks, at least not at first. Over time, they became very wealthy merchants, and they became even politicians by the 19th century. And so, continuing on this point of St. George, particularly, why St. George? Well, one of the things about it is that they were these stradieri, they were actual foot soldiers themselves. So seeing St. George, which by the way is not one of the main saints you normally see from the Middle Ages, it is much more often if you see a saint slaying a dragon, usually it's Michael. He's less human. San Giorgio, St. George, has an incredibly human side. He defeats the dragon and marries a princess. It's a very human story, even though he is a saint. Now, the reason that he would have been on horseback and that was so important, which is very important to the imagery and iconography of St. George, is that a lot of the men who came from this district of the Schiavioni, of this particular group, would have been on horses themselves. They would have had horseback type jobs. And another reason, though, is that as I said, even though it's unusual as a patron saint in general, in Venice, St. George, there's a lot of St. George imagery all over the place, all over the city. In fact, there's the very large church, the very famous church, San Giorgio. So St. George is very much a Venetian saint. He's very revered, specifically on this island. And it also so happened to be that St. George was already the patron saint of many of these people. St. George is a very prominent saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church, much more so than in the Western Catholic Church. And the use of the saint also in the relic, it should be noted in this case, was very much a unifying thing. There was a relic that did appear later on at this place. Now, let's zoom in more on the three paintings, and let's go inside and let's zoom in more on the big paintings that are in this confraternity, which are there are three telli, three big paintings on canvas by Vittore Carpaccio. Now, they were done between 1502 and 1507. It should be noted that Carpaccio passes away in 1520, so it's near the end of Carpaccio's life. And it's interesting that they chose Carpaccio specifically because he's more of a Venetian choice, really, than a Dalmatian, or he doesn't really come from any of these groups, but it was very much their way of these groups to announce that they too are part of the fabric of Venice. First, we have the slaying of the dragon by St. George. And we have a very interesting detail here, the foreshortening specifically of the skulls. It's also noted that the plethora of bones in this image really refer to the bones of St. George, that the relic that was later, much later, donated to the confraternity. And this skull specifically that's upside down, the foreshortening that had to be done of the cheekbones, it's really quite extraordinary. All of these images are extraordinarily detailed. We really see the microscopic detailing of the Northern Renaissance really coming into Northern Italy at this point. And Carpaccio is an interesting artist for this because he exists in this time, the later part of us figuring things out geometrically in the Renaissance, and right before the High Renaissance, or here right at the beginning of the High Renaissance. So we still have some early Renaissance influences here, but we also can start to see some of the stuff that's going to happen, that Da Vinci is going to play with, that Raffaello is going to play with, the great artists of the High Renaissance who we know so well. So we move on to the Triumph scene, and this scene is truly very interesting because it sparks actually very many several things. First of all, the scene makes it very clear from the image of the Temple of the Rock in the background, which was taken actually from a woodcut that Carpaccio would have seen. He had never actually seen the Temple of the Rock. In order to, again, as I talked about in the slaying scene, it talked about the relic by evoking so many bones. It's not necessarily something we see even in that scene. This was also evoking the fact that the relic itself had to come from Jerusalem. But another thing that this painting really evokes is that this is the first time that we really see, according to the story of St. George, the Selenites, the pagans for whom he slays the dragon. Now, what's really interesting about this particular painting is that we can see that the king is dressed as a very high level man of the Mamluk Empire. Specifically, we can see from his headdress, it looks very similar to this painting over here, which is technically deemed anonymous. It has been attributed to Bellini's studio multiple times, of which this particular painting shows the Venetian delegates arriving at the governor's palace of the Mamluk Empire in Damascus. And we can see from the headdress that it's very, very similar. And it's interesting because Venice had business with the Mamluk Empire. In fact, many delegates from the Mamluk Empire lived here and influenced Venetian architecture. It's part of what makes Venice so unique from the rest of Italy architecturally, and especially the Doge's Palace definitely owes the Mamluk Empire for its brilliance and its architecture, for sure. This being said, we have the king of the Selenites in this painting, who very obviously is a high-level Mamluk man, and what that means in the future paintings, it changes the narrative a bit of this cycle of three paintings, in that also we have to remember that as Stradieri, the Schiavoni often as a group dealt with any kinds of issues or anything like that, if Venice ever had them, with the Mamluk Empire. We also, as I explained, the Ottoman Empire, when this confraternity was established, was shortly thereafter born. The Mamluk Empire would become part of the Ottoman Empire during this time, and of course, as there were trade relations with the Mamluk Empire, there would then become trade relations with the Ottoman Empire that the Schiavoni as a group would often mediate and would often be part of the mediation of those transactions and of those sometimes again, historians are divided. Some historians say that they were there only for the conflicts. There are some historians who also say that it's more complex than that. And we definitely see that in these paintings. So now we enter the last painting, the baptizing of the Selenites, which is is an important part, I suppose, of the St. George story. Now, as has already been established, what is unusual about these paintings is that the king in the story, which in the original Bible story is pagan, is a Selenite, is in this case, as we have identified, in fact, Mamluk. And what's interesting about this last part of the cycle is, again, historians are rather divided. There are some that say, well, it's complete Orientalizing because they have to, the Mamluks in this case are forced to remove their headwear in order to be baptized into Christianity. The thing about this painting, though, and other historians bring this up as well, it's not complete othering that happens here, because in the act of being baptized and being Christianized, the Selenites in the story, the Mamluks in this painting, become, by the perspective of
the Christian viewer one of us, one of the included group of Christians, which includes the Christian viewer. It's an extraordinary view because what it shows us is it shows us a very complex and very delicate relationship that the Schiavoni group of people would have had with the Mamluk and later the Ottoman empires, that wasn't simply a sense of just us and them. There wasn't completely blind othering. That isn't to say that there wasn't othering. There is orientalizing here, there is othering that happens here because there is a disrespect of the religion of Islam, forcing them to baptize themselves in order to become part of the Christian community. That being said, though, the fact that that the Mamluk people can move outside of that particular identity uh, is extraordinary. Again, is not something that we really will see anywhere else in the Renaissance as far as interactions with this particular empire is concerned, which is really quite extraordinary in the cycle.
So, as we've seen, the symbol of St. George, how it was important to this group, how it was important to the city of Venice, and how it was important also in the way that this group not only expressed their own iconography and iconology, but also in how they integrated with Venetian society, and how the dialogues around this are very complex and they're very heated even now as to what exactly these images meant and what exactly they meant to these people, to Venice, why they were painted the way that they were painted, because they're not like, as I noted, many types of this type of iconography. You don't see it very often, which is why it's very special. It's why it's very particular to here. Thank you so much, and excited to see you next time on Art of the Week with Katya. See you soon.